We are often told that there have been multiple ice ages over a few billion years, but you say there's only been one ice age. How do you explain that?
Noah's flood was the key to the ice age. The ice age occurred after Noah's flood. Noah's flood provided exactly the conditions for that ice age. It explains it beautifully. People who think there are multiple ice ages, the ice ages that they talk about did not happen. But when we're talking about the ice age, people make assumptions about it.
What about your assumptions as a biblical creationist? What assumptions do you have? You've probably heard that the Earth has been through multiple ice ages over a few billion years. But what if that timeline is way off? What if there was only one ice age and it happened only recently? My guest here today is Dr. Tas Walker, a geologist with over 30 years of experience, and he has a significant interest into the Ice Age. Tas, I've heard you say there's only one Ice Age, and it happened only thousands of years ago. How do you explain that?
Well, in a nutshell, the explanation is different starting assumptions. And assumptions are the things that facts that you take into account or facts that you introduce when you don't have all the facts. There's one famous author said that assumptions are dangerous. They make you believe things that aren't really there. And then in the case of the geology and the ice ages, we're talking about something that happened a long time ago. Nobody was there at the time to see it. And so people make different assumptions about it. So geologists, when we're talking about the Ice Age is different from empirical geology. Empirical geology is when geologists go out into the field and they look at the rocks, they bring rocks into the lab, they do analysis of them, and then they look at them under the microscope. It's all about observation and recording. Geologists are very good at that. And actually, I believe everything that my geological colleagues actually observe. And they believe what I observe too. But when we're talking about the Ice Age, it's in the past. Nobody was there to see it happen. And so people make assumptions about it, and that's where the differences come in.
Okay, so we've got 5 ice ages compared to one ice age relatively recently. And you're saying the difference here is assumptions. Talk more about those assumptions.
Well, the assumptions are what happened in the past, a person's belief about what the past was like. And mainstream geologists, they assume that the past is basically the same as what the present is. So they have this idea, the present is the key to the past. And it's called uniformitarianism. That's a little jargon word that's used for it. And the idea is that we just look at the present and we extrapolate it into the past. The idea of uniformitarianism is quite plausible, but nobody can know whether it's really true or not. And that's where the issue comes about. So that's where geologists start making that assumption about uniformitarianism. And also, that assumption introduces the idea that the world is millions and millions of years old. So the idea of millions of years for the age of the Earth doesn't come from radioactive dating. It comes from the assumption that the past is the same as the present. And so it's actually a philosophical assumption.
Okay, so people who believe in millions of years and 5 ice ages, thereabouts, believe that because of their assumptions in uniform change over time. What about your assumptions as a biblical creationist? What assumptions do you have for your view?
Well, we start with the assumption that the Bible is reliable history. Now, a lot of people don't like that idea, but the Bible is actually an incredible book that records of lots of history. It's got well-documented chronologies, which people can follow, and it's remained the same for thousands of years. And so that's where we begin, assuming the history of the Bible. And so when you look at the history of the Bible, the key is Noah's flood. And Noah's flood accounts for a huge catastrophe which affected the geology of the whole earth, actually from Precambrian, that's sort of the geology starts there, and it goes to the present time. So from a biblical perspective, all of that geological record is explained by Noah's flood, except for a little bit at the very end, and that's where the Ice Age fits, right at the very end.
So you're talking about Noah's flood, and how long ago would these things have been, and the Ice Age after Noah's flood?
Well, Noah's flood ended at about 4,500 years ago. It actually only lasted 1 year, and so that's when the whole account started, and so how we understand it.
Thanks for watching the interview so far. Just a quick one. If you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button so you can see more of this content. Back to the interview. Okay. Well, thanks for helping me understand those different assumptions that make sense for how we get to those different views. Now, I've still got so many questions about the Ice Age. So, can you tell me where do we actually find evidence of the Ice Age? Do we see things in the ground or in landscapes that tell us that there was an Ice Age sometime in the past?
Well, probably the best way to start this is to think about how scientists first came to understand this evidence. And it was a Swiss scientist by the name of Louis Agassiz who collected this evidence, and he presented it to a conference of scientists back in the 1830s. And he produced lots of evidence that there was far more ice covering the earth than what we see today. And he produced things like the shapes of valleys, hanging valleys. There are things like drumlins where there were lumps of the earth was moved around. There are things like big heaps of broken rocks which are down the sides of what was once glaciers. They're called moraines, and also at the end of the glacier called terminal moraines, so they find those. So there's a lot of amazing evidence that's found that there was an ice age. For another evidence is that there's smooth rocks which are scratched, indicating that they were scratched by glaciers. And so Louis Agassiz presented this evidence to the conference, and the conclusion that there was a lot more ice covering it in the past. And that was 1837.
And did his new ideas of an ice age, were they well received when he first proposed these ideas?
Well, actually, they weren't well received. They didn't like the idea. And as a matter of fact, they were quite sort of hostile, critical of what he presented. And there's a certain reason for that. And it took decades before people finally accepted his claim that there was more ice in the past. And there's a reason for that as to why they wouldn't accept it. And that is because, and there's still the same reason exists today, that is because they couldn't figure out what caused the Ice Age to start and what caused it to end. And so they couldn't think of what that was, so they rejected the evidence.
Right. So it's been quite a while since the theory was proposed, and it's been a long time to work on solving that mystery. And you said that secular scientists have got some ideas. Do you think that mystery is solved now, or do you think there's still problems?
Well, I think the secular scientists would consider that it's solved. There's a general consensus about what happened at that time in the past, but I wouldn't agree that it's solved at all. And because they are still facing lots of problems, unanswered questions. So if it was solved, it would have the questions answered, wouldn't it? But it doesn't. One of the popular ideas today is the Milankovitch Cycles. That's what they appeal to today as to the reason for the Ice Age. Going back, when they first started thinking about this, they were thinking about, okay, how could we get a colder Earth to be able to explain ice in the past? So they thought, well, maybe there was a big meteorite impact. So that was one idea. Maybe there were volcanic supervolcanoes, and that caused, cooling of the Earth. Or maybe the sun was cooler. Or maybe the Earth's orbit changed or something like that. Or maybe there was a difference in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that caused it. And so there were all these sorts of ideas that were put forward. And the one that people like today is Milankovitch Cycles, named after a guy by the name of Milankovitch, of course. And he came up with this. It's quite a complicated idea, and I think that's why so many people like it. It's to do with changes in the Earth's orbit, orbital characteristics like the inclination of the Earth. Earth's axis has changed like a spinning top. It precesses, and the Earth's orbit, the actual shape of the orbit and the orientation of the orbit changes cyclically. And so that's the idea now. And so the cycles vary from, say, 25,000 years to 100,000 years, which is very nice. And so you can fit all sorts of things into these cycles. And so it's a very, very popular theory. But there's a problem with it. The problem is that even with these changes, there's not enough variation in the energy to the Earth to produce an ice age. It's only small changes. So they've come up with an explanation to add a secondary hypothesis into this to produce larger temperature changes. And this secondary hypothesis, it's interesting that it has an effect which causes a lot of concern, a lot of alarm. And this secondary hypothesis introduces what you could call positive feedback into the climate system.
Positive feedback. Sounds like a technical term. It's not just a pat on the back, is it?
Sounds like a pat on the back, doesn't it? It does sound like that. But I think we've all experienced positive feedback, particularly with PA systems where somebody's got a microphone and they're talking to an audience and the volume gets turned up a bit too loud, or the microphone gets too close to the speaker, and there's a scream that just immediately erupts, and everybody's covering their ears. It's just very unpleasant. So that's positive feedback. It's an instability. And so this putting a positive feedback into an explanation of Earth's climate is introducing an instability into the climate, and that's what's causing climate scientists to be very concerned about it.
Yeah, so I can understand now why they would need it, because they need some way to get, down to those temperatures they want for the ice age. But are there some problems with positive feedback? It sounds like it just gets worse and like it cycles out of control. Is that an issue for them?
That is an issue. And so there's a concern that the Earth will reach a tipping point, just a little bit more, and it will just cycle out of control, go over a cliff, that sort of a thing. And so that's why there's this big concern about climate today. It's not because of the facts, but it's because of the models that are used. And it's based particularly on the long age uniformitarian model that the present explains the past, that's where this climate alarm or climate concern is coming from, and it's basically a result of the model that's used. If there is positive feedback, it means Earth's climate is unstable.
Right. So there's positive feedback mechanism. It has some issues for the secular worldview, the uniformitarian worldview. But what about the biblical worldview factoring in the ice age after the flood? Are there positive feedback issues there?
No, there are not issues there. There's no problems there because it gives a different explanation. You start with what the Bible talks about, and it gives you different insights and explanations to test and look at. And so from the Bible's point of view, starting with that, most of the geologic column, of course, as we've mentioned, was deposited during Noah's flood. And this evidence that Louis Agassiz was referring to was evidence which is very, very recent in geological terms. It's actually, if we do an analysis of it, it occurred after the flood. And that provides the ideal conditions or the conditions for producing an ice age. So in actual fact, the flood was a catastrophic event that involved lots of volcanic activity, and the oceans became heated in this time. As you can imagine, you've got volcanoes, you've got granite plutons, which are under the earth, heating the earth. And so the oceans were warmer at the end of the flood. So the floodwaters came off, the oceans were warmer, and that produced the conditions necessary to produce the ice age.
Hang on, so you're saying warmer oceans? Don't we need like an ice age? Surely we need things to be cold. How does that happen?
You'd think that it need to be cold. You know, an ice age, it's not necessary to be cold. It's not cold climate that changed it. It's warm oceans. So what they did, the warm oceans produces a lot more evaporation, and this evaporation, a lot more moisture in the air comes down on the continents as snow and rainfall, precipitation. And so as a result of that, on the higher altitudes, there's ice buildup as a result of this increased precipitation. And as a result of this ice buildup, it goes from year to year, building up, building up, building up while the oceans are warm. And they stayed warm for about 500 years. That's one estimate that's made. And then as the oceans cooled, the ice melted back over a period of about 200 years.
Okay, I'm starting to understand this a bit more, but I've still got a few more questions. We've got a warm flood, the warm flood waters, and then, the flood waters, they recede, and then we've got this ice age that happens afterwards, because we've got all this water available to be snow and precipitation, like you said. But there's still got to be some level of cooling going on. How does that happen?
Well, there was some level of cooling, and one of the other factors, which is a significant factor, is that the volcanic activity during the flood produced or propelled ash and dust into the atmosphere. And so there were a lot of aerosols high in the atmosphere, which prevented the sun or reduced the amount of sun reaching the earth. And so the ice that built up during the summer did not melt back entirely during the winter. So that's why it built up from year to year to year until the ocean started to cool.
Very interesting. Now, we've also got 5 ice ages described by the mainstream science or secular scientists. And what you're talking about is one ice age after Noah's flood. Do we have to fit the other ice ages into the biblical time frame as well?
Well, no, we don't, because the other ice ages, they were not ice ages. They didn't exist. So the secular scientist, he comes up with 5 ice ages because he's got millions of years, and he assumes that what happens at the present is what happens in the past. Here's an ice age here, very close to the present. So he assumes that there must be ice ages in the past. And so whenever he sees any evidence that could be interpreted as an ice age, he will say, there's an ice age here. And so they've identified 4 others apart from the most recent one, although different scientists refer to different numbers of ice ages. And so if ever they discover, say, rocks which have got scratches on them, there was a glacier here, so they talk about an ice age. Or if they discover a large boulder sitting in the middle of nowhere, they say, there must have been, they can't imagine that it was washed in by a lot of water, because you'd need a flood of biblical proportions. So they say there must have been covered in water here under an ocean, and glaciers on top, ice flows on top, and they drop down these boulders, you see. So that's where it comes from. And there's boulders on display in various places around Australia. I've been in Western Australia in a little town, and they've got a little column, and they got a big boulder sitting on the top of it. And they say this boulder was dropped from ice, 200 million years ago, when the Australia was covered in an ocean. So they go on like this with an interpretation, and they see that people see they see the boulder and they see the explanation, and so they think it's true, but it just comes out of their worldview. And actually the boulders were washed in by Noah's flood. I've been down to Eagle Hawk Neck in Tasmania, and again you've got sediments there, sandy sediment, sandstone, and it's nicely cut into blocks, which they call a tessellated pavement. And they've got little rocks in there in the sand, and they sort of think, these must have been dropped in, because you can't imagine washing all those bigger rocks in. So that's the way the geologists work. The other thing they discover is they find great big piles of broken rock, and they give it a name. They call it tillite, which means it's produced by glaciers. So they automatically have interpreted in the way they report it. That's one of the problems that biblical geologists have. They have to sort of be careful about what's reported to make sure that they're not introducing part of the worldview into, just accepting it the way it's reported. So they report it as tillite, but in actual fact, it doesn't match the sort of modern way we see tillite, these moraines. And a lot of people are interpreting this as a huge, enormous underwater avalanche of material that's sort of avalanched down a continental slope. And as the waters of Noah's flood are bringing in the sediment, bringing in more sediment, it builds up and eventually it collapses down the slope. And so there's a certain period in geological history where a lot of these occurred. And they say this was an ice age period, you see, where in actual fact it's better interpreted as just these underwater avalanches.
Okay. That's a lot going on there. You mentioned moraines. Can you just explain what that is for us?
Moraine is an ice age term for this heap of rocks. So there's a glacier moving along and it pushes and breaks up the rocks. And there's a heap of rocks at the front, which is called the terminal moraine, the end of the glacier. And there's these broken rocks go right down the side of the glacier and they're called lateral moraines.
Okay. So it's sort of like almost the boundaries of the glacier in a way?
The way it flowed down, the way it pushed the rocks down. So you see it, yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. I think that really makes the point that, you mentioned at the start about assumptions, that the geologists have got the same evidence, the same rocks, moraines, all these things, but it's how you interpret that over time, and that's starting to make a lot more sense for me now. Yes. Now, you also mentioned about climate and that some of the secular ideas about the Ice Age have people alarmed, I guess is the word for it, about climate changes and tipping points, where if something, small changes here, we have a positive feedback loop and everything goes out of control. How do you see that from a biblical worldview when you look at the Ice Age?
Entirely differently. We see a world that's been designed and it's very stable. The climate is very stable. So from a biblical point of view, we've explained before as to how the flood provided the conditions to create the Ice Age. And so the flood was a huge sort of catastrophe, a huge disturbance, disruption on the earth. And what happened after the flood, the earth returned to stability, to return to some sort of an equilibrium after about 700 years. That's the idea. So the earth is a stable system and it should give us confidence. It should give us a sense of peace about the fact that we've got a world that was well designed and we don't have to be alarmed that it's going to fall off the edge of a cliff.
Hope you're enjoying the interview so far. We'll jump back in shortly, but real quick. Imagine bringing this life-changing message to your church or community. This is exactly what we do. We present at close to 1,000 events each year. So many people struggle with how science and the Bible fit together, and it becomes a genuine stumbling block for their faith. But our speakers present satisfying answers that really make sense. We've received hundreds, possibly thousands of testimonies from people who have had their lives changed through our speaking ministry. If you'd like that for your congregation or community, then use the link in the description and contact us today. Now, we had a previous video on the Ice Ages, and in the comments section, we had a lot of people asking about woolly mammoths. And I thought we have to talk about that today. Can you tell us about woolly mammoths and how they fit into the Ice Age?
Well, a woolly mammoth is a big elephant. That's what it is. It looks like an elephant. And they were big. A person is about 2 meters tall, sort of. And a woolly mammoth was about 4 meters tall. They weighed 4 tons, which is an enormous weight. They had a very thick fur, and it was shaggy. It's got actually 2 layers on the fur. The outer layer was shaggy. And they had these enormous tusks, which are characteristic. People always recognize the woolly mammoth from the tusks. That's the woolly mammoth. And they lived up in areas in the northern hemisphere which they wouldn't be able to survive today. They're very, very cold. And so that's created a problem, a question for the secular thinker as to why have things changed? What happened so that they lived there then and they don't live there now? So that's where the woolly mammoths lived. Siberia, Mongolia, North America, Canada, and across in Europe and Scandinavia and across towards towards Russia. So that's where they used to live.
Yeah, I remember one of my favourite movies growing up was Ice Age. It was an animation movie, and they had Manny the mammoth, but they had some other creatures. Sid the sloth.
Oh yeah,
it's quite a funny character, and Diego the saber-toothed tiger. Now those other sorts of creatures like the saber-toothed tiger, and I think is megafauna what they call like bigger creatures back then. Were they around in the Ice Age as well? Like, is that movie kind of accurate?
Yeah, the megafauna describes the large animals like rabbits and, other things like that wouldn't be called megafauna. Things like foxes wouldn't be called megafauna, but it's animals which are, say, over 40 kilograms. They're quite large animals are called megafauna. There are lots of other animals that lived up with the woolly mammoths, including the saber-toothed tiger, which you've mentioned. And then there was actually a woolly rhinoceros. There were horses, there were wolves, there were bison, and all those sorts of animals which lived in this area. Most people are not aware of this. And so it was a very lush area. They called it the mammoth steppe. And a lot of people, the secular thinker is puzzled as to why it was so lush and productive. And that's because it was the warm oceans at the end of the flood. And these warm oceans in the Antarctic Ocean in particular, the areas which were near the ocean were a very, very excellent climate. And the ice was not in that area. It was in the higher elevations and up towards the mountains. So it was a mixture of ice and really great climate at the end of the flood.
Right. So the flood explains how they could live because of you've got some grassy areas in the lower areas, and then you've got the ice on the mountains and things. But then I want to think about how they went extinct. We've got woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers going extinct. How do you explain that?
Well, there were a lot of animals up here. There were thousands of woolly mammoths. And of course, there was time from when the first elephants came off Noah's Ark for them to migrate up to this area and multiply up in the hundreds of years after the flood. So as the Ice Age reached its peak and the climate started to change, it was climate change that caused the problem. But it wasn't climate change caused to human activities. It was climate change caused by the progress of the Ice Age. So when the Ice Age peaked, the ocean started to get cooler. The precipitation started to reduce, and so there was not as much vegetation. The temperature started to get cold, and it was more erratic. So the various climate scientists have looked at this and have been able to work out and come to conclusions about what the climate was like. So this caused basically an ecological catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age peak, and that's why these animals went extinct.
Right, so they essentially ran out of food to eat.
Ran out of food to eat, that's right.
Yeah, well, what about, there's a few cases of woolly mammoths being snap frozen. Well, that's the way it's described in news headlines. They find a woolly mammoth and it's snap frozen. How do you explain those cases?
Well, the idea is that the climate changed really suddenly, like a icy meteorite coming in and striking the area. That's one of the ideas that's put forward, but it wasn't as rapid as that. And one of the explanations, which I think is a very good one, is that as the ice retreated, it exposed the land without vegetation. There was lots of drainage of the water from the Ice Age as it melted, carrying down sediment. And any wind, much more windy area now at this period in the sequence, the wind would pick up the exposed land and create dust, these huge dust storms. And that seems to have been a really big factor in why we find these woolly mammoths and other animals like the saber-toothed tiger well preserved. And it sounds a big ask to talk about dust storms, but we do have other examples. There was one period in US history where they called it the Great Dust Bowl of central USA, where there were lots of droughts, and they were not farming the land. They couldn't get the crops to grow, and it created a lot of dust. And so much so that people had to abandon their properties. Houses had huge piles of dust sitting against the side of them, and that sort of thing. And lots of things were buried, barns were buried, and that sort of thing. So that's sort of an example of how it could have happened during the Ice Age at the end of it, as it was melting back. The dust, when it settles, is given a name. It's called loess, and so we find this sediment, this particular this feature of loess right through that area, and that's what the woolly mammoths are buried in. They call it muck in the North America, so it's not like normal sediment, and it's been buried in this dust storms. And what that does is the dust freezes in the climate, and so that preserves the creature, so it preserves his body so it doesn't rot, doesn't decay. And also that's why you find that you can find the hair on it, you can find soft tissue, you can find various features like that because it's preserved. And also it prevents other animals from scavenging them because the dust has covered them. And even one woolly mammoth, or several, have been found in standing position. So the dust, they've been buried while they're standing in this dust storm, and which they would have been buried within days, and then they've remained standing. And so that's created the puzzle.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. A dust storm could come so quickly, and if you've seen people have seen dust storms, they know just how everything gets covered. That makes sense to me, mixed with the cold climate as well, and cold weather. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing so much about the Ice Age. You've answered a lot of questions that I've had, and hopefully our listeners too. Can you just summarise the Ice Age and how it fits in with the biblical time frame for us?
Well, the fact that it does fit in with the biblical time frame produces surprise in a lot of people, because they don't imagine that the Bible can speak to these scientific things which they see on TV and which they encounter in all sorts of places. And they're not aware that there are so many puzzles with the scientific explanation. So understanding how the biblical worldview works, how it explains the evidence, I think gives it's a different way of looking at the world, and it's a way that is not just random processes, natural laws, and very impersonal. It comes from, the Bible tells us about the Creator God who made the world, and there's a person behind it all. And I think that can totally change a person's outlook on the world, to understand that there's a meaning and purpose to my life.
Yeah, well, it's really important to have that information to understand these things and be able to trust the Bible for all the other great messages it gives us. Well, it's been so wonderful to hear all this information about the Ice Age and how relevant it is, and how with the right knowledge about this topic, we can actually answer a lot of questions people have. Now, we've actually got a book written by one of our climate scientists, Mike Ord. I've actually got it here with me. So do you want to talk about this book, Tas, and why you think this will help people be better equipped to talk about questions about the Ice Age?
I like the colour. How Noah's Flood Caused a Single Ice Age. It's all there in the title, and there's a picture of the Earth with ice on it. So Mike Ord's a great climate scientist, and he's done a lot of work on this. And this book has got lots of pictures. I like it because it's so well illustrated. And I think this would, for anybody that's had a bit of a curiosity aroused by this particular video, I think they would find this book very, very helpful. And it would give them a sense of confidence, and they would be amazed and encouraged to be able to see what's described in this book in the world around them. And when they're watching TV, they'll be able to reinterpret it for themselves and for their kids. So it's a great book, How Noah's Flood Caused a Single Ice Age. This is a book that you can get at the website creation.com.
We'll also put a link in the description, so if anyone wants to get it there, they can just click on the link. Well, thanks for joining us today, Tas. It's been a real pleasure having you here talk about the Ice Age.
Thanks, Michael.